When Harold Bennett walked into Iron Ridge Community Bank carrying a faded blue passbook from 1968, the young teller laughed before he even reached the counter. She told him the account was probably worthless. Then security escorted him outside while customers watched in silence. 11 weeks later, federal examiners arrived at that same bank with sealed warrants, freezing a merger worth nearly $1.8 billion. And it all started with a forgotten savings account nobody bothered to take seriously. Harold Bennett was 72 years old. Most people in the small town of Ash Creek barely noticed him anymore. He lived alone at the edge of town in a weathered white farmhouse with peeling paint and a collapsing wooden fence that he kept promising himself he would repair one day. For 40 years, Harold had worked the same land his father worked before him. Corn in the spring. Soybeans in the summer. Repairs during winter when the cold settled deep into the valley. He wasn't poor exactly. But after hospital bills, drought seasons, and his wife Eleanor's long battle with lung disease, there wasn't much left. The farmhouse felt emptier after she died. Every room carried traces of her. Her reading glasses still rested beside the kitchen sink. Her sewing basket remained untouched near the fireplace. Sometimes Harold still caught himself turning to speak to her before remembering the silence waiting behind him. 3 months after the funeral, property taxes arrived. The amount was higher than he expected. Harold sat at the kitchen table late into the evening studying the bill while rain tapped softly against the windows. He knew he needed money quickly. The harvest wouldn't come for another 7 weeks. That's when he remembered the passbook. The old blue booklet had belonged to Eleanor's father. Harold recalled seeing it years earlier inside a cedar storage chest in the attic. The next morning he climbed the narrow attic stairs with a flashlight. Dust drifted through beams of pale sunlight cutting through the roof slats. Old Christmas decorations sat beside stacks of yellowed newspapers. Eleanor's wedding dress hung beneath a plastic sheet near the back wall. Then he found the cedar chest. Inside were war ration stamps, old photographs, handwritten letters, and beneath them all, the passbook. Ash Creek Agricultural Savings and Trust. Opened, June 14, 1968. Balance, $412.63. Harold almost smiled. $400 wasn't life-changing. But it was enough to cover the taxes and buy him time. What he didn't realize was that the bank listed on the passbook no longer existed. In 1994, Ash Creek Agricultural Savings had been absorbed into Iron Ridge Community Bank during a regional acquisition spree that swallowed several small rural institutions. Harold didn't understand any of that. He simply drove into town the following Monday wearing his brown work jacket and carrying the passbook carefully inside an envelope Eleanor once used for family documents. Iron Ridge Community Bank stood in the center of Ash Creek beside the courthouse square. Tall glass windows. Polished marble floors. Bright digital displays advertising retirement portfolios and commercial investments. Harold looked painfully out of place the moment he entered. The teller at the counter couldn't have been older than 25. Her nameplate read, Madison. Harold slid the passbook across the counter gently. I'd like to withdraw what's left in this account. Madison opened the booklet and frowned immediately. She flipped through several pages before laughing quietly toward another employee nearby. You still use this thing? She asked. Harold shifted uncomfortably. It belonged to my wife's father. Madison typed something into her computer. Her expression changed from amusement to irritation. This bank doesn't even exist anymore. I was told your company bought them. Well, maybe decades ago, she replied. But there's no digital account linked to this. Harold nodded politely. There should still be records somewhere. Madison sighed loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. Sir, you can't just walk in with an ancient booklet and expect money. A few people nearby glanced toward him. Harold felt heat rising into his face. I'm only asking you to check. She disappeared briefly into the back office. When she returned, a branch manager followed behind her. His name was Greg Holloway. Expensive watch. Sharp gray suit. Permanent expression of irritation. Greg barely looked at Harold before speaking. This account is inactive and unverifiable. Harold held the passbook carefully. But it's official. Greg shrugged. Could be decorative for all I know. Several customers laughed quietly. Then Greg made the mistake that would eventually destroy everything. He pushed the passbook back across the counter and said, "Sir, this isn't a museum." The room went silent. Harold stared at the booklet for several seconds before picking it up slowly. "I understand," he said softly. Greg nodded toward security near the entrance. "Please don't hold up the line." Harold walked out beneath the eyes of strangers trying not to watch him. But that wasn't the worst part. Outside the bank, Harold realized someone had stamped the front of the passbook in red ink while it sat behind the counter. Invalid document. The stamp covered Eleanor's father's signature. Harold stood frozen on the sidewalk staring at it. Then he folded the booklet carefully and drove home in silence. For several days, he told nobody what happened. Not even his daughter Claire. Claire Bennett lived 2 counties away and worked as a paralegal for a small legal office specializing in probate cases and land disputes. She visited the farmhouse the following weekend. The moment she saw Harold sitting quietly at the kitchen table, she knew something was wrong. He tried dismissing it at first. But eventually he handed her the passbook. Claire read every page carefully. Then she noticed something unusual near the inside binding. A certification seal. Small. Barely visible. Federal Rural Deposit Protection Program. Claire frowned immediately. She had never heard of it before. That night she searched through old banking archives online. 3 hours later, she stopped breathing for a moment. The Federal Rural Deposit Protection Program had been created during the late 1960s to protect agricultural savings accounts held by struggling farming communities during bank consolidations. Under federal law, participating institutions were required to preserve all inherited rural deposit accounts permanently during mergers and acquisitions. Not 7 years. Not 20 years. Permanently. Claire kept reading. Then everything changed. A 1971 Treasury compliance letter stated that destroying, denying, or improperly invalidating protected agricultural deposit records could trigger mandatory federal review of every acquisition connected to the institution. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. Iron Ridge Community Bank wasn't just expanding locally anymore. They were finalizing a massive interstate merger awaiting federal approval. And if the bank had mishandled protected accounts, the merger could collapse instantly. 3 weeks later, the phone rang. Harold answered while repairing fence posts outside. "Mr. Bennett." "Yes." "This is Daniel Reeves with the Office of Federal Banking Compliance." Harold looked confused. "We'd like to ask a few questions regarding your visit to Iron Ridge Community Bank." By the end of the week, investigators arrived in Ash Creek. Quietly at first. 2 black sedans parked outside the branch during business hours. Employees whispered nervously behind the counters. Greg Holloway assured everyone it was routine. But investigators kept returning. Then they requested archived acquisition records. Then internal merger compliance reports. That's when panic started spreading inside the executive offices. Because the investigators discovered Harold's account wasn't unique. Not even close. Over 600 protected agricultural accounts had disappeared during system conversions following multiple acquisitions across rural counties. Some were marked inactive improperly. Others had missing documentation. Several showed evidence of manual deletion. And every single one violated federal preservation requirements tied to interstate merger approval. The timing could not have been worse. Iron Ridge executives were preparing the largest expansion deal in company history. Press releases had already been drafted. Commercial investors were already celebrating. Then federal regulators suspended the merger review indefinitely. Stock analysts began asking questions. Local newspapers picked up the story first. Then regional financial reporters. Then national business media. The forgotten farm accounts blocking $1 billion merger. That headline appeared everywhere. Greg Holloway disappeared from public view almost immediately. Madison's teller footage from the security cameras was reviewed repeatedly during internal investigations. The footage showed Harold standing calmly while employees laughed. Then the red invalid stamp. Federal auditors considered the footage evidence of institutional negligence. But what they discovered next was even worse. Internal emails revealed executives had quietly accelerated archival destruction during earlier acquisitions to reduce long-term liability exposure tied to dormant rural accounts. The estimated financial exposure exceeded $240 million. 3 senior compliance officers resigned within 2 days. Federal regulators froze the merger completely. Multiple civil investigations opened simultaneously. Shareholders filed lawsuits. The bank's expansion partner withdrew from negotiations before the month ended. Inside Ash Creek, people suddenly treated Harold differently. Neighbors waved when he drove into town. The diner owner refused to charge him for coffee. Strangers stopped him outside the hardware store just to shake his hand. Harold never seemed comfortable with any of it. One afternoon, Claire asked him whether he regretted going to the bank that day. He looked out across the fields for a long moment before answering. "I only wanted enough money to pay taxes." Then he smiled faintly. Eleanor would have laughed herself sick over all this. Winter arrived early that year. Snow covered the farmhouse fields while federal hearings continued hundreds of miles away. Iron Ridge Community Bank closed 17 rural branches before the end of the quarter. Greg Holloway quietly resigned. The merger officially collapsed for months after Harold first walked into the branch. Federal penalties followed shortly after. But for Harold, none of that mattered much anymore. One evening, Claire returned to the farmhouse carrying a small envelope. "What's this?" Harold asked. She handed it to him carefully. Inside was a reimbursement settlement tied to Eleanor's father's original protected account. Adjusted for preservation violations, accumulated interest, and federal penalties. The amount was just over $183,000. Harold stared at the number silently. Not because it made him rich, but because somebody finally admitted the account mattered. The following spring, workers repaired the farmhouse roof. The fence was replaced. And for the first time in years, Harold planted crops without worrying whether the land would survive another season. Sometimes the smallest humiliations expose the largest corruption. And sometimes powerful institutions forget something dangerous. Ordinary people still keep records.